The first time I met Vivian Montgomery, she hugged me with one arm and kept a glass of Chardonnay perfectly level in the other. "So you're the famous Emma," she'd said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "James has told me so little about you. That should have been my first warning." But when you're in love with someone like James Montgomery, with his architect's eye for beauty, his patience, and that dimple that appears only when he laughs at your worst jokes, you tend to overlook the red flags waving in your peripheral vision. We met at a charity auction where I'd been photographing the event for the local paper. James had bid an outrageous amount on a weekend getaway, not because he wanted it, but because the proceeds went to the children's hospital where his father had worked before passing away. I captured his triumphant grin when he won, and later when I approached him for a quote, he asked for my number instead. Our relationship progressed with the comfortable inevitability of a well-written story. Within 18 months we were living together in his downtown loft, planning a wedding and sketching out designs for our future home. James understood my ambitions as a photographer, and I admired his dedication to creating sustainable architecture. We were that couple friends rolled their eyes at disgustingly happy, finishing each other's sentences, building a life brick by perfect brick. The wedding was set for June at the Montgomery family's lakeside property, a stunning colonial revival that had been in James' family for generations. It should have been perfect, would have been perfect, if not for Vivian. The interference started small. A comment about my dress being brave when I selected a modernist design rather than something traditional. A casual remark at our engagement party about how temporary creative careers can be. The way she'd reminisce about James's ex-girlfriend Charlotte whenever I was within earshot. "Charlotte's family has known us for generations," she'd sigh to James's aunt while shooting me a sidelong glance. "Such a shame things didn't work out there." James would squeeze my hand beneath the table, whispering, "She just needs time to adjust." But time only seemed to sharpen Vivian's tactics. She insisted on being involved in every wedding decision, questioning my choices with the surgical precision of someone who had been planning this day since her son was born, and perhaps she had. When I selected wildflowers for the centerpieces, Vivian emailed the florist directly to correct the order to roses. When James and I chose a local band, she called the venue to ask about their noise policies, nearly causing them to back out. 6 months before the wedding, Vivian suggested I move my studio equipment from the spare bedroom in our loft to make room for visiting family. When I explained I needed the space for work, she tilted her head sympathetically. "Of course, dear, though I always imagined James was someone who prioritized family. His father and I both worked, but I always put the home first." James was caught in the middle, trying to mediate between the woman who raised him and the woman he chose to love. "Mom means well" became his mantra. But I could see the toll it was taking on him, the tension in his shoulders, the way he'd check his phone nervously when it buzzed. I tried to build bridges. I invited Vivian to lunch, asked about family traditions we could incorporate, even suggested she help design the invitations since she had a background in graphic arts. Sometimes in rare moments I'd glimpse what might have been approval in her eyes, but it never lasted. 3 months before the wedding, at our rehearsal dinner venue tasting, Vivian pulled the event coordinator aside. I wasn't meant to overhear their conversation, but as I returned from the restroom, her voice carried across the empty restaurant. "Emma is lovely, of course," she was saying, her voice honeyed with false sincerity, "but between us, I'm not certain this is going to stick. Best to keep the deposit refundable if possible." I stood frozen, my hand gripping the back of a chair so tightly my knuckles went white. Little did I know, this moment would be just the first drop in a gathering storm. Vivian Montgomery had plans for her son and they didn't include me. And I, still naive, still believing that love conquers all, had no idea how far she would go to remove me from the picture. 8 weeks before our wedding, a spring thunderstorm knocked out power to half the neighborhood. James was away at a sustainable building conference in Seattle, leaving me alone in our darkened loft with only candlelight and a rapidly draining phone battery for company. I was searching for the emergency lantern James insisted we keep in his home office when I knocked over a stack of folders. As I gathered the scattered papers, a name caught my eye: Charlotte Winters, James's ex. The one Vivian constantly referenced with wistful sighs. I shouldn't have looked. In the 5 years we'd been together, I'd never once violated James's privacy. But there, illuminated by the flickering candlelight, was an email chain printed and annotated in Vivian's unmistakable handwriting. The correspondence was recent, dated just 3 weeks earlier. Vivian had reached out to Charlotte, informing her that James is making a terrible mistake and still speaks of you often. She'd invited Charlotte to coffee, then forwarded their conversation to James with a note. Just keeping options open for you, darling. Mother knows best. James had never mentioned this. My hands trembled as I read his response, brief but clear. Stop this, Mom. I'm marrying Emma. But Vivian hadn't stopped. The folder contained evidence of her methodical campaign, a draft of a prenuptial agreement she'd had drawn up without our knowledge. Notes from conversations with my future in-laws highlighting any perceived flaws in my character. A list titled Wedding Concerns that included entries like Emma's family, financial situation, and potential career instability, children. Most disturbing was a letter addressed to my boss at the newspaper, written on Montgomery family letterhead but never sent, subtly implying I had misrepresented my photography credentials. The implied threat was clear. Vivian was prepared to damage my professional reputation if necessary. I sat on the floor of James's office, surrounded by this evidence of betrayal, feeling as if the ground had shifted beneath me. The power flickered back on, the sudden light harsh and unforgiving. Then I found it, a sealed envelope addressed to James in handwriting I didn't recognize. Inside was a birth certificate. A child born to Vivian Montgomery 30 years ago, a daughter given up for adoption 3 years before James was born. There was also a recent letter from this daughter, now a woman named Rebecca, seeking contact with her biological family. Vivian had hidden this from everyone, including her own son. The letter indicated Rebecca had reached out multiple times over the past year, only to be rebuffed and threatened with legal action if she persisted. The revelation struck me like a physical blow. This wasn't just about me. Vivian Montgomery had built her perfect life and family image on secrets and control. James had a sister he knew nothing about, a sister Vivian had abandoned and was now desperately keeping hidden. I carefully replaced everything except for photos I took with my phone as evidence. When James called later that night, I fought to keep my voice normal, making excuses about a headache to explain my distraction. That night I barely slept. By morning my shock had crystallized into something harder. The woman who would become my mother-in-law wasn't just difficult or overprotective. She was manipulative and dangerous. She had worked systematically to undermine me, all while maintaining her polished facade of maternal concern. My first instinct was to confront her immediately, but a cooler voice in my mind counseled patience. Vivian had spent decades constructing her careful image. If I moved too quickly or carelessly, she would simply paint me as hysterical or vindictive. No, this required strategy. The wedding was approaching rapidly, with guests already booking flights. James deserved to know the truth about his mother and the sister he never knew he had. But the revelation needed to be handled carefully. As I showered and dressed for work the next morning, a plan began forming in my mind. James would return in 3 days. Until then, I would continue as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. In the quiet aftermath of my discovery, one thought kept repeating: Vivian Montgomery had declared war on my future, and I would not be her casualty. The 3 days before James returned were the longest of my life. I maintained a careful facade, responding to Vivian's wedding-related texts with my usual restraint, continuing final preparations as if my world hadn't just shattered and reformed around this new reality. When James finally arrived home, exhausted from his conference but smiling at the sight of me, I nearly broke. How could I tell him that the mother he loved and respected had not only tried to sabotage our relationship but had hidden the existence of a sibling from him his entire life? That night, after dinner, I showed him everything. I found these by accident, I explained, my voice steady despite my racing heart. I wouldn't normally look through your things, but once I saw what was happening, James, I had to know. He sat in stunned silence, methodically reviewing each document, each email. When he reached the birth certificate and the letters from Rebecca, his face went completely blank. A defense mechanism I recognized from the rare times he discussed his father's death. I've always known Mom could be difficult, he finally said, his voice hollow. But this is something else entirely. We talked until dawn. About Vivian, about Rebecca, about what it all meant for us. At one point, James looked at me with red-rimmed eyes and asked the question that had been hovering between us. Do you still want to marry me? After seeing all this, I took his face in my hands. I'm marrying you, James, not your mother. But we need a plan. That became our mantra over the following days. We need a plan. First, James attempted a confrontation with Vivian about Rebecca. It went exactly as I'd feared: denials, then tears, then a masterful deflection that somehow ended with James apologizing to her. She's had decades to perfect this, I reminded him afterward. We won't win through direct confrontation. Instead, we shifted strategies. The wedding would proceed, but on our terms, with our eyes wide open. I reached out to James's cousin, Eliza, who had always seemed uncomfortable around Vivian. Over coffee, she confirmed what I suspected: Vivian had interfered in her marriage too, nearly causing a divorce before Eliza's husband put his foot down and cut contact. She eagerly joined our cause, connecting us with others in the family who had experienced similar manipulation. Aunt Vivian has burned a lot of bridges, Eliza explained. People just don't talk about it because she's so good at playing the victim afterward. Meanwhile, James hired a private investigator to locate Rebecca. We wouldn't contact her yet, not until after the wedding, but we wanted to be prepared with verified information. 2 weeks before the wedding, I made my most difficult decision. I drove to see my future father-in-law's oldest friend, Dr. Robert Chen. Now retired from medical practice, he had been the best man at Vivian's wedding and remained close to the family. I've suspected for years, he admitted after I explained what we'd discovered. There were inconsistencies in some of Vivian's stories. I never felt it was my place to question, but if she's actively hurting people, hurting you and James, then my silence serves no one. Dr. Chen provided the final pieces of our plan: context, history, and most importantly, credibility. As James's godfather, his presence would be essential. In the final days before the wedding, we prepared for multiple scenarios. If Vivian remained silent, we would proceed with our planned confrontation after returning from our honeymoon. If she escalated her interference, we had responses ready, but deep down, I knew what would happen. Vivian Montgomery would not relinquish control quietly. The wedding, her son's wedding, the social event she had been curating for months despite our resistance, would be her stage. And if there's one thing I'd learned about my future mother-in-law, it was that she could not resist an audience. The night before our wedding, as we finalized the last details of our contingency plans, James looked at me with a mixture of sadness and resolve. Are you sure about this? It's not too late to elope. I thought about it briefly, longingly, but shook my head. This isn't just about us anymore. It's about Rebecca, about your family, about ending this cycle. Tomorrow, one way or another, the truth comes out. I slept fitfully that night, rehearsing scenarios in my mind. By morning, I felt strangely calm. I'd spent months trying to earn Vivian's approval, to fit into the Montgomery family on her terms. Now I understood that had never been possible. Today I would marry James, and if Vivian chose to make her stand, I would be ready. The Montgomery estate looked like something from a fairy tale. Morning sunlight dappled the lawn through ancient oak trees, white chairs arranged in perfect rows facing the lake. Flowers spilled from every conceivable surface, not my chosen wildflowers, but Vivian's preferred roses. I didn't care anymore. The flowers weren't important. In the upstairs guest room that had been converted to a bridal suite, my mother helped with my dress while my bridesmaids buzzed around with mimosas and nervous energy. Through the window, I could see guests arriving, greeting each other with the particular combination of formality and warmth that characterizes family weddings. You seem very calm, my mother observed, securing the last button on my dress. I was a mess on my wedding day. I met her eyes in the mirror. I'm exactly where I need to be. She squeezed my shoulders, not quite understanding but supportive nonetheless. My parents had met Vivian only a handful of times, and while they sensed her disapproval, I'd spared them the details of her interference. Some battles weren't theirs to fight. Eliza appeared at the door. She's here, she reported, slightly breathless. Full regalia, wearing that diamond brooch Uncle William gave her, the one that's practically a family heirloom. And the other arrangements? I asked. All in place. Dr. Chen is seated near the front. The envelope is with the officiant. Everyone's on standby. Eliza handed me my bouquet, white roses interspersed with small sprigs of lavender I'd added that morning. A reminder that even in Vivian's carefully controlled world, I could still assert my own touches. The ceremony was scheduled for noon. At 11:55, I heard the string quartet begin to play, signaling guests to take their seats. At 11:57, my father appeared to escort me downstairs. "Nervous?" he asked, offering his arm. I smiled, "Not about marrying James." He patted my hand. "That Montgomery woman has another thing coming if she thinks she can intimidate my daughter." Outside, I took a deep breath of summer air. Then to the strains of Pachelbel's canon, one traditional choice I'd actually agreed with, I began the walk toward my future husband. James looked breathtaking in his charcoal suit, his eyes finding mine immediately. Behind him stood his groomsman, and to the side, in a pale blue dress that probably cost more than my car, Vivian Montgomery watched me approach with the tight smile of someone who has just detected an unpleasant odor but is too polite to mention it. Our officiant, James, former professor and mentor, began the ceremony with warm words about union and partnership. I barely heard them, too focused on James' hands holding mine, on the subtle nod Dr. Chen gave me from the third row, on the almost imperceptible tension in Vivian's posture. When we reached our vows, James went first. His words were everything I could have hoped for: honest, vulnerable, a promise not just of love, but of partnership and growth. I felt tears threatening and blinked them back. I needed to be clear-eyed for what might come next. I began my own vows, speaking directly to James about our journey together, about building a future on truth and trust. As I neared the conclusion, I saw Vivian shift in her seat, one hand moving to the clasp of her small handbag. The officiant smiled at the gathered guests. "If anyone can show just cause why this couple cannot lawfully be joined together in matrimony, let them speak now or forever hold their peace." In the weighted silence that followed, I heard birds calling from the lakeside, the rustle of a breeze through the oak trees, the quiet intake of breath from someone nearby. Then Vivian stood. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the lawn. "I cannot remain silent. There are things that need to be said before this goes any further." A collective gasp rippled through the guests. James' best man muttered a curse under his breath. James himself stiffened beside me, but I squeezed his hand reassuringly. We had prepared for this. Vivian stepped forward, addressing not us but the assembled guests. "This wedding is proceeding under false pretenses. There are serious matters that haven't been disclosed, matters that affect the Montgomery family name and legacy." "Mother," James said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "This is not the time." "It's exactly the time," Vivian interrupted. "Before you make a mistake you can't undo. Emma is not who you think she is." She turned to me, eyes glittering with triumph. "Tell them about the meetings you've been having with Dr. Chen, or should I? Tell them about the documents you've been gathering behind my son's back." I looked at her calmly, then turned to our officiant. "Professor Wilson, I believe there's an envelope you're holding for just this moment." Looking relieved to have direction, he extracted a sealed envelope from inside his jacket. "Yes, Miss Roberts asked me to keep this secure until needed." "Please open it," I requested. As he broke the seal, I addressed our bewildered guests. "I apologize for this interruption to our celebration. Mrs. Montgomery is correct that there are matters that haven't been disclosed publicly. Since she feels they can't wait until after our ceremony, we'll address them now." Professor Wilson had removed the contents of the envelope: several photographs, the copy of a birth certificate, letters and printed emails. He glanced at them, his eyebrows rising in surprise. "Mrs. Montgomery," I continued, keeping my voice level, "has been concerned about my suitability for her son. She's expressed this by attempting to reconnect James with his ex-girlfriend, by researching ways to discredit my career, and by systematically turning family members against me." Murmurs swept through the audience. Vivian's face had gone pale. "What Emma is saying is true," James added, his voice carrying across the stunned gathering. "We have evidence of all of it, but that's not the most serious matter." Dr. Chen stood now, moving to stand beside us. "Vivian," he said gently, "it's time to end the secrets." I gestured to the documents Professor Wilson held. Mrs. Montgomery has hidden from her family that James has an older sister named Rebecca, born 3 years before him, and given up for adoption. Rebecca has been trying to connect with her biological family, only to be threatened with legal action if she persisted. Vivian's face contorted with rage. You had no right. Those were private matters. They ceased to be private when you used them as weapons, I replied. When you constructed a false reality for your family based on secrets and manipulation. James stepped forward. Mother, we know everything. We know about the prenuptial agreement you tried to arrange without my knowledge. We know about the letters you sent to Emma's colleagues questioning her professional credentials. We know about Charlotte, about the family property you tried to transfer solely to my name before the wedding. And most importantly, I added, meeting Vivian's gaze steadily, we know about Rebecca, your daughter, James' Sissis, a woman who only wants to know her family. The silence that followed was absolute. Vivian stood frozen, her carefully constructed reality crumbling around her. Then, with deliberate movements, she gathered her handbag and began walking back up the aisle toward the house. Vivian, Dr. Chen called after her. Running from this won't make it disappear. She paused, turning to face the assembly one last time. Her eyes found mine, filled with such cold hatred that I felt an involuntary shiver. You'll regret this, she said simply. Then she continued her retreat, disappearing into the house as whispers erupted among the guests. I turned to James, suddenly uncertain. We had anticipated confrontation, but the reality of publicly exposing these secrets in front of everyone they loved was something else entirely. Should we continue? Professor Wilson asked uncertainly. James looked at me, then at the scattered papers in the officiant's hands, then at the empty doorway where his mother had vanished. For a terrible moment, I feared he would follow her, that blood ties would prove stronger than the truth. Instead, he turned to face our guests. My fiancé and I have just demonstrated why honesty must be the foundation of our marriage, he said, a slight tremor in his voice. I apologize for this unusual beginning to our celebration. If you'll bear with us, we'd like to continue with our ceremony. He looked at me then, his eyes asking a silent question. I nodded, relief washing through me. After all, I added, loud enough for everyone to hear, we've waited far too long for this day to let anything stop us now. A tentative wave of applause began, growing stronger as our friends and family showed their support. Professor Wilson gathered the papers back into their envelope and picked up where we had left off. 20 minutes later, we were pronounced husband and wife. As we kissed, I felt the weight of secrets lifting, replaced by the much lighter burden of truth. What none of us realized as we moved toward the reception tent with renewed celebration was that Vivian Montgomery was not a woman who accepted defeat easily, and that her final act was yet to come. The reception began with an undercurrent of tension beneath the festivities. Servers circulated with champagne and canapés, while guests clustered in small groups, conversations punctuated by furtive glances toward the main house where Vivian had retreated. No one quite knew how to address what they'd witnessed during the ceremony. Should someone check on her? James' Aunt Margaret asked as we greeted guests in the receiving line. She needs time, Dr. Chen answered. Before we could respond. This has been a long time coming. James maintained a composed exterior, smiling and thanking people for coming, but I felt the slight tremor in his hand clasped in mine. For all our preparation, exposing his mother's deceptions had wounded him deeply. I wondered if I'd been selfish in pushing for this public confrontation rather than handling it privately. Stop it, he whispered when we had a moment alone. I can see you second-guessing everything. We did what we had to do. But are you okay? I searched his face. Really okay? He considered this, then nodded slowly. I'm grieving the mother I thought I had, but that person never existed. I'd rather know the truth, even if it hurts. Our first dance was scheduled to begin shortly, and the band was setting up when Eliza rushed over, her face tense. She's gone, she reported. Her car's missing, and so is her overnight bag. The house staff said she left without a word. James exhaled slowly. Maybe that's best. We can deal with everything after the honeymoon. I nodded, relief mingling with lingering apprehension. Something about Vivian's exit felt too easy, too quiet for a woman who had spent decades controlling narratives. We proceeded with the first dance, then the toasts. James' best friend gave a moving speech about resilience and choosing your own family. My maid of honor followed with stories that had everyone laughing. For a while, the earlier drama receded as celebration took its place. Then, as dinner was being served, a commotion arose at the entrance to the tent. The string quartet faltered mid-song. Through the open tent flap walked a woman I'd never seen before, tall and elegant in a simple blue dress, with James' distinct jawline and eyes. Beside her stood Vivian, her expression unreadable. Rebecca. It had to be. A hush fell over the gathering as Vivian guided the woman toward our table at the center of the tent. James rose slowly, his face a mixture of shock and wonder. James, Vivian said, her voice carrying across the silent tent. I'd like you to meet your sister Rebecca Harlow. Rebecca, this is your brother James, and his new wife Emma. Time seemed to stop as I tried to process what was happening. This was not the venomous counterattack we'd expected. Instead, Vivian had done the one thing we hadn't prepared for. She'd embraced the very truth we'd used as a weapon. Rebecca stepped forward hesitantly. I'm sorry to crash your wedding. Her voice caught. I've waited so long to meet you. James moved around the table in 3 long strides and embraced his sister without hesitation. The tent erupted in a mixture of applause, gasps, and confused questions. I stood, moving to join them. But Vivian intercepted me, gripping my arm with surprising strength. You thought you were so clever, she hissed under her breath, her smile never faltering for the benefit of onlookers. But remember, I've been managing this family since before you were born. She released me and turned to face the gathered guests, raising her voice. I owe everyone an apology for my behavior earlier. When Emma and James confronted me with the truth about Rebecca last week, I was ashamed and defensive. I've spent 30 years trying to bury this secret out of misplaced pride and fear. My mouth fell open. This was a masterful revision of history, one that painted her as merely reluctant rather than actively obstructionist, and suggested we had confronted her privately rather than discovering the truth ourselves. But seeing my son's courage today, she continued, gave me the strength to do what I should have done years ago. While you were all enjoying the reception, I drove to Rebecca's hotel. It was time to bring our family together, all of us, with no more secrets. The gathered guests were captivated by this narrative of redemption. Even those who had witnessed her behavior at the ceremony seemed willing to accept this new version of events, the mother who had made mistakes but was now bravely correcting them. Dr. Chen caught my eye from across the tent, his expression grim. He understood what was happening. Vivian wasn't admitting defeat, she was rewriting the narrative in real time, recasting herself as the heroine of this story. Meanwhile, James and Rebecca remained locked in conversation. 30 years of separation condensed into urgent whispers and tearful laughs. Their connection was immediate and undeniable. Whatever else happened, this reunion was genuine and precious. I stood alone, watching my wedding reception transform into something I no longer controlled. The woman who had tried to prevent our marriage had now co-opted it for her own redemption arc. The family secret we had planned to reveal carefully after the honeymoon was now the centerpiece of our wedding day, but with Vivian as its curator rather than its villain. As if sensing my thoughts, Vivian approached, champagne flute in hand. You'll find, dear Emma, that I always land on my feet. Her smile never reached her eyes. James may be your husband, but he'll always be my son first. Remember that. Before I could respond, she clinked her glass against mine and turned away, moving to join James and Rebecca with the practiced grace of someone who had spent a lifetime managing perceptions. I watched her go, suddenly understanding that this battle had evolved into something far more complex than I had anticipated. Vivian wasn't fighting to prevent our marriage anymore. She was fighting to maintain her central place in the family narrative, even as that family expanded to include both me and the daughter she had once abandoned. And in that moment, standing alone amidst my own wedding celebration, I realized that defeating Vivian Montgomery would require more than just exposing her secrets. It would mean offering something she could never provide: authenticity over performance, connection over control. The game had changed, and so too must my strategy. Our wedding night was spent in long conversation, not romance. James, Rebecca, and I retreated to the guest house on the property after the reception, while Vivian held court in the main house, graciously accepting praise for her courageous family reunion. "I can't believe she did this," Rebecca said, curled up in an armchair, still processing the day's events. "When she showed up at my hotel, I thought she was going to threaten me again. Instead, she apologized, said she'd been wrong all these years." "Was it genuine?" I asked. Rebecca considered this. The apology felt rehearsed, but the urgency was real. "She practically rushed me into her car." James rubbed his temples. "Because she needed to rewrite the narrative before it solidified against her." "What bothers me most," I admitted, "is that it worked. Everyone's talking about her bravery now, not her decades of deception." We talked until dawn, the three of us forming an alliance none of us had anticipated 24 hours earlier. Rebecca shared stories of her adoptive family, loving but modest people who had given her a stable childhood in Minnesota. James filled in the gaps of the Montgomery history, seeing it now through new, more critical eyes. And I listened, formulating a plan. The honeymoon we'd planned, 2 weeks in coastal Italy, was scheduled to begin the following day. Instead, we made a decision that would permanently alter our relationship with Vivian. "Are you sure?" James asked as we packed our bags the next morning. "She'll see this as the ultimate betrayal." "Good," I replied, surprising myself with the steel in my voice. "Let her." We informed the family we were postponing our honeymoon. Instead, Rebecca would join us for a week at James's lakeside cabin a few hours north, neutral territory, where they could begin building their relationship without Vivian's orchestration. When told of our change in plans, Vivian's practiced smile flickered. "But everything's arranged for your trip. The villa, the private tours, all your arrangements," I pointed out. "For once we're making our own." We left before she could mount a counter-argument. The cabin was rustic but beautiful, nestled among pine trees with a dock extending into clear water. For 7 days, James and Rebecca reconstructed their fractured family history, while I documented everything, not just in words but in photographs. The siblings wading into the lake at sunset, their identical expressions of concentration as they built a bonfire. The moment Rebecca showed James pictures of her children, his niece and nephew, for the first time. On our return to the city, we had one final confrontation with Vivian. She'd invited us to dinner at her penthouse apartment, ostensibly to welcome us home, though I suspected she wanted to reassert control after our unplanned detour. The table was set with Montgomery family china, the meal catered perfectly. Vivian wore a sage green dress that matched her dining room walls, everything coordinated for maximum impact. "I've been thinking," she announced over appetizers, "about the east wing of the house. It would make a lovely nursery someday, don't you think?" James glanced at me, then set down his fork. "Actually, Mother, we've made some decisions while we were away." I removed a folder from my bag and slid it across the table. Inside was a contract for a plot of land we'd purchased 30 miles outside the city. "We're building our own home," I explained. "Construction starts next month." Vivian's face tightened, "But the Montgomery estate has always passed to the next generation. Your children should grow up there, as you did, James." "Our children will grow up in a home without secrets," James replied firmly. "And they'll know their Aunt Rebecca and cousins from the beginning." Vivian picked up her wine glass, knuckles white around the stem. "I see you've made up your minds. Though I wonder if you've considered the financial implications. The Montgomery Trust has certain conditions." This was her final card, the family money that had provided James' comfortable upbringing. "We'd anticipated this too." "We've got that covered," I said, pulling out the second folder. "Rebecca and James have agreed to petition the trust together. With 2 legitimate Montgomery heirs making the request, the trustees will have to revise the terms." Vivian set down her glass too hard, wine sloshing over the rim onto pristine white linen. For once she didn't bother to blot it. "You think you've won," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "You think you can just rewrite decades of family tradition because you found one inconvenient truth." I leaned forward. No, Vivian. You're the one who rewrote our wedding day to cast yourself as the hero. But here's the difference. Your version was for show. Ours is for life. James reached for my hand across the table, then spoke the words that would define our future relationship with his mother. We're not cutting you out, Mom. But from now on, you're welcome in our lives as a guest, not a director. We left her sitting alone at her perfect table, the carefully arranged flowers already beginning to wilt in their crystal vase. 1 year later, we moved into our newly built home, modern, open with walls of windows that let in light from every direction. Rebecca and her family visited often. Dr. Chen became a regular Sunday dinner guest. Even some of the extended Montgomery family, long held at arm's length by Vivian, found their way back into our lives. Vivian herself maintained her social standing, telling anyone who would listen about her brave reunion with her long-lost daughter. In public, she played the role of doting mother and grandmother-to-be when I became pregnant with twins. But we all recognized the performance for what it was. On the twins' first birthday, a boy and girl with James's eyes and my stubborn chin, we gave them family names. Robert after Dr. Chen, and Elizabeth after James' beloved aunt. Not Montgomery names, though they carried the Montgomery surname. New traditions for a new generation. Vivian arrived late to the celebration, bearing extravagant gifts and her practiced smile. I watched her move through the gathering, still elegant, still controlled, but somehow diminished. Her power had always depended on secrets and manipulation. In their absence, she was just a woman growing older, playing a part that fewer and fewer people believed. That night, after the guests had gone and the twins were asleep, James found me in our kitchen, looking through the photographs from the party. "Penny, for your thoughts," he asked, wrapping his arms around me from behind. I showed him a picture I'd captured without planning to, Vivian standing slightly apart from the group, watching as Rebecca helped one of the twins blow out a candle. Her expression, unguarded for once, was a complex mixture of regret and resignation. "Do you think she's capable of change?" I asked. "Really changing, not just adapting her performance?" James considered this, then shrugged. "I don't know. But it doesn't matter anymore, does it? We've built something she can't control." He was right. Our revenge, if you could call it that, wasn't in exposing Vivian's secrets or diminishing her social standing. It was in creating a family founded on transparency instead of image, on genuine connection rather than careful curation. The real shock on my wedding day hadn't been Vivian's objection or our counter-revelation. It had been the moment we realized that winning against someone like Vivian Montgomery didn't mean destroying her, it meant becoming immune to her methods. Now surrounded by the home we'd built and the family we'd chosen, that immunity felt like the most valuable wedding gift we could have received.